Oh hey, didn't see you there. Welcome to part 3 of the How to Paint Digital Cityscapes for Beginners series. I apologize this one took so long to make. I haven't forgot about the series, but we are here now and we're going to jump straight into learning how to use smart objects and custom shapes. So if you want to paint digital environments in a similar style to Spider-Verse or Intergalactic, a huge component of painting cities is using custom shapes and also smart objects. So instead of painting every single thing by hand, it really does help having a toolbox of assets that we can draw from when we create cities. So that includes things like having pre-made windows, pre-made brick textures, even entire building faces as well. And this is going to help us save so much pain when we jump into it. In this video, we are going to be looking at what smart objects even are, how you might use them to save time when painting cities, and also how to create your own custom library of custom shapes. If you have missed videos 1 and 2 in the series, which I don't blame you because they were 5 months ago, I'm going to link them down in the description below, and without yapping, let's just get straight into it. Okay, so the way that I see it, now that we know how to use the lasso tool and we also know how to make really clean shapes in Photoshop, the next issue is actually jumping in and trying to paint an urban environment, or in this case, a city. So it's extremely daunting when you jump in trying to paint a cityscape for the first time, just because there's so many details. There's a lot of perspective involved. It can get very, very overwhelming very quickly, but I would definitely recommend to zoom out and sort of take a look at what we're actually trying to paint first. Okay, so we're going to jump straight into Photoshop here, and this is a reference picture that I took in the city a couple of years ago. We're going to be using this as an example to illustrate how to use smart objects and custom shapes in Photoshop. And then later, we're actually going to be painting this environment together. So the first thing is, when I'm looking at this image here, instead of getting lost in all of the details of all the windows and all the textures and everything like that, I'm instead just going to focus on the main building blocks of this image. When you're deciding to paint a cityscape as well, and the references that you choose on Google, for example, or in Pinterest, pick ones that are fairly simple to begin with. Don't do an entire gigantic Manhattan landscape just yet, but have enough elements there that you can use what I've taught you in videos 1 and 2 and keep things relatively easy as well. The reason that I've chosen this image here is that it's got a very, very clear focus of this middle building here, but we do also have a couple of ones at the side. So again, when I'm analyzing this image, the first thing that I'm going to notice, instead of all the windows and all the different details and things like that, is instead the literal building blocks, which are going to be this. So this one here will be building 1. This is building 2, building 3, building 4, and then this section here is just like the street level with all of the rubbish and everything like that. When I'm looking at this image here, I can tell this is sort of how I'm breaking it apart. This is how I want to group things when I actually go to paint stuff. Now, theoretically, we could go in and paint every single detail by hand, but that's just going to take way too long. And as I mentioned, the main focus here is to keep things as simple as possible. So this is where smart objects now come into play. So at its core, a smart object is a layer in Photoshop that you can edit and resize without losing pixel information. So in a normal layer such as this, I've got this circle here. If I go ahead and transform this and make it really, really, really small, just like this, I hit enter, and then I'm going to make it big again. You're going to see that it's become extremely blurry. So the reason that this is happening is as soon as I commit that change, once the circle is small, Photoshop then throws away a whole bunch of pixel information, so by the time I make it big again, it's not exactly what it was to begin with. So a smart object isn't going to do that. So another thing is, in a normal Photoshop layer such as this one, if I go ahead and edit and warp this in perspective, so let's just say that I'm trying to create like a face of a building or a window or something like that. I'm happy with the changes here. I'm going to press enter. And now I've got this square in perspective. If I try and move it in perspective again, or if I just decided that I want to edit anything, if I press Ctrl T, notice how the bounding box has gone back to being a square. So it's going to be really, really awkward and really hard to try and get that same level of control that we had before, because it's committed that change, and now Photoshop is treating this square as a diamond when it's really the window that we're trying to paint. So if I go ahead and convert this to a smart object now, I'm going to go ahead and right click on that layer and go down here to convert to smart object. As soon as you do that, this little page here will show up on the bottom layer of the icon. And now if I move this around, if I go ahead and scale it down and be really, really small, press enter and scale it back up, you're going to notice that it's still nice and crisp. It's not as blurry as we had just a minute ago with the circle. The same thing is, if I go ahead and now warp this into perspective, so you can see where this X is here, can move this around and hit enter. If I now decide that I want to edit this, if I go back and press Ctrl T, it's still retaining that same shape. So I want to put it simply, the reason that I use smart objects is because I want to give myself the most amount of flexibility at the beginning when I'm painting cities. The way that I would like you to think about smart objects is we're essentially creating flat textures, whether it's building faces or windows or whatever. We're going to warp them into perspective and then commit the change and continue painting. So another good example I can give you is, if you've seen my how to paint building Spider-Verse style, this bit's going to be a little bit familiar, but say that this shape here is going to be my new building face that I'm painting, and I want to add a bunch of windows to it. A very easy way of doing that is I'm going to create a new layer, and then using the marquee selection tool, just go ahead and fill in a shape such as this, and then I'm just going to duplicate this a bunch of times. And the way that I'm doing that is by holding Alt and Shift and then just dragging this forward. So it's just duplicating that last section there. I'm going to go ahead and select all of these new shapes that I've just created, hit these 3 dots here, and then where it says distribute spacing, I'm going to hit this one here just so it makes all of those rectangles nice and even. Once that's all done, I'm going to press Ctrl E to merge everything together, Ctrl J to duplicate, Ctrl T to transform, and then Shift and drag down. And oh, it looks like I've missed one over here, so I'm just going to delete that. Now that I've got this, I can do the same thing again by Alt and dragging, and then maybe just one more, Alt and dragging, so this building has 4 stories. I'm going to go ahead and merge all of that into one layer, so now we've got the master window shape, such as this. And now you'll see the reason that I use smart objects is if I go ahead and press Ctrl T to transform, and I sort of move this in perspective, right? And let's just say I hit enter, and this is obviously an exaggeration, but if I want to go ahead and change this now, once I press Ctrl T, because this is a normal layer and not a smart object, you'll see that the bounding box is again a square. And if I try and warp it back into perspective, it's not too bad. It's still fairly easy, but if I hold Shift and I'm trying to extend this row of buildings down, it's not going to be playing nice. I'll show you exactly what I mean if this was a smart object. I'm going to go back to our normal layer here, make this a smart object, press Ctrl T, and then go ahead and move it down like this. And let's just say that I mess up the perspective again here. This is just to illustrate a point. But we've got the shape here, but because it's a smart object now, I'm going to press Ctrl T to transform. I've got the most amount of control to move this back into perspective here. And now if I hold Shift and select this middle anchor point, I can now scale this down here. So it's going to keep that same perspective and make it a lot easier when we go to edit. So now that I've got my windows over here, you'll notice that if I try and paint into it, it's going to create a new layer here. And it's not going to let me paint into the smart object because it's a vector image. And from here, we've got our window shapes. I can go ahead and right click and choose rasterize layer. I can add a clipping mask over and then paint directly in my windows here. And so this is a really cool way that you can do reflections. You can really do a lot of extra details and things of that nature with this method. Okay, so we've got it over here, and let me just first convert these colors into something a little bit more building-like. Okay, so now that we've got this window layer here, I can create a clipping mask on top of it and then just go ahead and paint inside. So there's all sorts of different details we can use. And you can go ahead and start to use the lasso tool, just like this as well. And hopefully now you start to get the idea of how we're going to be approaching painting cities. It's just this method here used a bunch of different times, and you can really take this as far as you want. So smart objects are also great for windows in this example, like I mentioned, but you can even do an entire building face and warp it onto a cube essentially. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So instead of this example, what I'm going to do is just going to move this across here, and I'm just going to create a extremely flat plane, just like this. So now I'm going to create that same set of windows that I have, but I have a lot more control over it. So just that same Alt method, dragging it across, just like this. I get to choose exactly how many stories I want this building to be in, which is nice. And then maybe we just want to get the spacing correct like this. So now we've got this window layer and this background building layer sort of on one plane. We can take it a step further by detailing this background layer here. So what I'm going to do is hit the little checkerboard to lock the transparent pixels, and then go ahead and just detail it really, really roughly, just sort of like this. So now you'll see that I've got this building texture over here, and we can go ahead and warp this into perspective also using a smart object. Because I have a couple of different layers, I've got a layer here for the windows, I've also got a layer here for the background. I'm going to group this together. So by selecting all of these layers, make that into a group, and then right click and then choose convert to smart object. So now you'll see that if I go ahead and warp it, it's a lot easier and a lot faster, and I still get that same level of control using the perspective tools in Photoshop. I can extend quite easily this building if I wanted to. I can also make it really, really distorted this way, and all of it on the front is like a giant sticker, basically. If there's one thing that I want you to get away from this video is smart objects are giant stickers. You create the texture that you want, convert it into a smart object so that you can edit it in perspective as you wish, and then slap it on the building, and then you've already got yourself a building there. I suppose the best way I can describe it, and the reason I'm putting so much emphasis on smart objects, is that when we are painting cities, when we are painting buildings, there is so much perspective to know. There's so much perspective of the windows, of the bricks, of the tiles, of the textures, and painting every single thing by hand, as I mentioned at the beginning, is extremely painstaking. Yes, you can do it if you really want to, but these shortcuts here are so that you can go about your painting process a lot more efficiently and save you a lot of stress. When you are painting cities, the last thing that you want is to be so stuck in rigid in the perspective grid that you kind of lose sight of the art. So that's kind of why I put a lot of emphasis on these tools here. So as I mentioned before, I want you to think about smart objects as manipulating and warping textures into perspective, but custom shapes are actually creating that texture. Okay, let's just say in a really quick example that we're painting these two different buildings here, and we want to create a brick texture for both of them. One way that we could do it, hypothetically, is I could refer to my perspective grid here, zoom all the way in, and then literally just start drawing and painting a brick texture by hand. It's totally valid, of course, but it's a lot of work and it's going to take a very, very long time. When again, I think the main thing is focusing on the overall picture, making sure the values are nice, making sure the lighting is good, then the individual details, because there's a lot to get lost into. But you'll see that for custom shapes is that if I open up this custom shape menu here, these are all different pre-made ones that I have. You can use them across projects. This is the reason why custom shapes are so important, because the work that I've gone into different cityscapes can be continuously reused again and again, saving me a lot of time in the future and in the long run. So for example, I have this brick texture that I've already made, and now if I go ahead and drag this out here, and again, the scale's not really going to be correct, but that's not the main thing at play here. But I've got this shape. I can go ahead and convert this into a smart object, and just like I was showing you before, go ahead and warp this very, very easily into perspective. So that's number one. And for number two, for this building, say I want the bricks to be like more stretched out or whatever, I can do it that way. And because it doesn't cover the entire building, that's okay. I can simply duplicate it. And the ones that I've made are tileable. So we can go ahead and just extend it based off of our needs. So it's going to overextend a little bit. That is fine. We can just chop that off. And then we can sort of chop this bit off here. Well, convert this into a smart object. And now this building front is pretty flat in perspective, so it doesn't really need to be changed. But you can see how fast and how easy that is as well. The same thing, again, applies to windows. If I go ahead and just drag this shape out like this, probably want to give this a darker color. And once again, now I can very, very easily warp a bunch of windows in perspective as well. So I'm going to show you, and we're going to spend a little bit of time creating some custom shapes in Photoshop here, which will help for part 4 of the series when we actually go to paint that reference that I showed. The first thing is we're going to create a new Photoshop document just like this. So we're going to create something fairly high resolution here. And that's just so when we go to save our custom shapes, it's not going to be too pixelated and it's still going to be nice and high quality. So the first custom shape that we're going to make is a brick texture. And again, there's going to be a lot of uses for this as well. It's fairly straightforward. How I'm going to do it here is by using the marquee tool, go ahead and drag out a line like this and press Alt backspace to fill it in. And then I'm going to press Ctrl J and find sort of the rough spacing between bricks that I want. I'm going to do this a bunch of times going down. And maybe one more, just like this. Now again, I'm going to select all of those layers here. Go to those 3 dots and then press Distribute Spacing so that everything is nice and even. going to press Control E to merge everything together. So now that we've got this shape, we have to do the vertical bands now, or the vertical grouts. So creating a new layer, I'm going to go ahead and drag just like this here. And then I'm going to Alt and drag across. And what I'm going to do now is duplicate this and move it down. And you'll notice that bricks are offset. So we're going to go ahead and shift it in this way, just like this. Same thing. So now I'm going to move this down twice here. Move this down one more time over here as well. Select the top one. So one thing is I'm just going to erase the ends here because I don't want that brick to be closed off. And the reason why is because it needs to be tileable as well. If we move it around, that's going to interrupt the flow. So now that we've got this shape here, just going to go ahead and merge everything together. I'm going to convert this now into a smart object and just make it a little bit smaller just because I want to see how this tiles. So I'm going to duplicate it, drag it across, and then sort of right about there. So this is where it overlaps. You can see that if I go ahead and press enter, sweet, that tiles very nicely. So let's just say that I'm pretty happy with this here and I want to save this to make it a custom shape so I can use it in Photoshop. Again, the amount of bricks is really up to you. You can duplicate this down more, you can duplicate it across more. It's just whatever preference that you want. But now that we've got this, what I'm going to do is come up here into Window and then choose Paths at the bottom. So now that I've got this Paths tab open over here next to my layers. So now if you come back over to our brick layer, I should probably be naming this. If I control and click, it's going to select everything that's in that layer here. I'm going to go back to Paths, and at the bottom here where this little circle is with the 4 corners, I'm going to select that and it's going to make it a work path. Now that we've got this, there are going to be all these different little anchor points here. This is essentially Photoshop converting this into a vector. Now to save it as a custom shape, I'm going to go up into Edit, go all the way down and go Define Custom Shape. So this is going to come up over here. I'm going to name this Brick and press OK. Now that that's done, if I go up and select my custom shapes and open this drop down menu, this is our brick texture that we literally just made. Once I've selected that, make sure at the top left here, this says pixels instead of shape or path. And now if I go ahead, go back to my layer and drag, we are using that brick texture that we just made, and we can change all of the spacings and everything like that with it. So again, you can drag this down, convert it into a smart object, keep using it. That's just sort of the way that I like to use custom shapes. And of course, the exact same thing is applicable to Windows as well. So that same method of using the marquee tool and everything like that, we can go ahead. That exact same method we can also apply to Windows, of course, but the same thing again is control click on the layers that you want to make a shape, go into Path, hit that little work path thing. It's going to come up and choose all of our anchor points, and then Edit, Define Custom Shape just here. And I can call this Windows 1, for example. Not Windows 11, because I still use Windows 10. So now coming back up into the custom shape tool, and now you can see that exact window shape that we've created is saved. So one interesting thing about the custom shapes as well is that we don't always have to use the marquee tool. We can actually do a bit of painting. I'm going to go up here and select this inking brush that I've got. And you see that if I draw, it's got a nice little bit of texture here just around the sides. If I, for example, go ahead and just do that same brush, brick texture, sorry. So just over here like this. And I'm literally just drawing this out by hand. I'm not creating or using this with the rectangular marquee selection tool. A lot more stylized way of doing it. Something kind of like this. As long as I press Control and select that layer, go back into Path and make this a work path, you'll see the amount of anchor points that we've got in this image because it's very noisy to Photoshop. So again, Edit, and then go down into Define Custom Shape. I'm going to call this Stylized Bricks. Hit OK, and then go back into my layer and select that shape. And now you'll see we've got a very, very cool stylized kind of look. So it doesn't have to be very flat and boring as well. I would highly, highly recommend you to experiment with this as much as you want. Create all sorts of different textures and then go ahead and save them for your own projects as well. Now, if you are interested, I have made a pack with 30 different custom shapes that you can buy on my Gumroad. So these here, I've gone ahead and made a whole bunch of them. There's a bunch of vertical bands. horizontal bands as well. We've also got a whole bunch of different windows. Maybe too many windows, but you can never have too many in a building. All sorts of different ones like this. We've also got water towers that you can just sort of slap in there for a silhouette. And then we've also got this very, very detailed one as well. So this one here will just help to give a lot of extra visual noise and things of that nature. I also do have a tutorial specifically for how to use the set on my Gumroad, so I'd really appreciate it if you check it out. Okay, thank you for joining me today on part 3 of this graphic environment series. Originally, I did want to end the series here with part 3, but then I thought about it a little bit more, and the whole custom shapes and smart objects really is an important part of my workflow. So in part 4, we will finally go ahead and paint that reference picture that I have. I'm very excited to join you guys. Until next time, everybody, take care and stay safe.